Well, sorry about the horrible grainy image you're watching of my face, but I just wanted to make a few remarks before we start reading Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death." Like McLuhan, we're reading something from the past, a past which is to an old guy like me getting farther and farther away all the time. McLuhan was the great philosopher of my childhood. I was born in 1966, and I remember my dad was a teacher, and McLuhan's books being around the house. McLuhan made a famous cameo in a Woody Allen movie in 1977, Annie Hall, and my dad was the only person in the theater who laughed because he was the only person who recognized that it was actually Marshall McLuhan. So okay, it was a long time ago, was what I'm trying to say. And one of the things that we're struck with, obviously, looking at McLuhan's work, one of the things we're struck with is that some of it was very, very prescient. And the kind of remarks that he was making about his world, the contemporary media of his world, could very well be applied to the media of our own half a century later. Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death" was published in 1985, and I just wanted to give you a sense. I don't need to fill you in on recent history really, but some of you may not realize just how dominant television at one time was in the United States. It was, without a doubt, the most fundamental medium pre-internet. Really, it's only in the past 10 or 15 years, and really, frankly, only since streaming video, which was a huge and maybe not noticed enough change in American life and life around the world. The internet was about reading print and maybe being able to load a picture once in a while. If you think about the internet of your youth, dial-up, basically. I think that two huge changes happened. One was 2007 when YouTube came in. It just blew me away. The notion that people could upload videos to the internet, and you could watch all these things that individuals all over the world had uploaded. And not too far after that, not too much later, when Netflix changed over from a DVD by mail to a streaming service. Essentially, you can still do the DVD by mail thing, but it's essentially a streaming service. Hulu, Amazon Prime, all those sort of things now that are just so firmly entrenched in our lives that before that there was television. And one of the things that maybe Postman's not really taking into account by the mid 80s is cable television. Nobody had cable TV in my neighborhood before the early 80s. It was really something that very advanced or very cool or very rich people had. So when we talk about the dominance of television, we're talking about the dominance of network television. The American TV landscape was dominated by the three major networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC. There were alternatives, like there were local PBS affiliates, and there were what we called UHF stations, where you would see old movies. And we kids loved those stations because they were so cheap. They played old cartoons in the afternoons, and that was our lives. That was our dominant form of entertainment. Clearly, the world has changed very quickly in terms of that. We live in a world where especially people your age, I understand, are watching less TV in the sense of like turning on the TV and flipping around on channels. I cut the cord maybe 3 or 4 years ago, or our family did. We still watch TV, but no one watches TV. And so, clearly today, what is television? Television used to be a box in your living room and you'd turn it on. Today, television, people like you don't watch it that way. I mean, some of you do, which is fine, but my daughter doesn't turn on the TV. If she wants to watch a movie or TV show, whatever that means now, she watches it on, she probably steals it. I don't know. What do you kids do? So really, one of the things that obviously we want to keep in mind as we go through Postman's book is, read it and see, how whether we agree with his critique of television culture. Because after all, it is a book and a much more polemic and critical and negative book about the advent of new media, and in this case, television, which was certainly the medium that McLuhan was most concerned with, was the effects of television. Although he had this catch-all term, electric media, the cool medium of television. We want to keep in mind, we want to read the critique, we want to think, learn from it, and we definitely want to apply it as much as we can to our contemporary world. But it's clear that we have to do some updating, that we live in a different world than Postman did in 1985. And that's really why I made this video. I mean, television was it in 1985. And in the sense of being that box, which, it was just the beginning of the of the video cassette recorder, the VCR, was a huge thing in the 80s. The idea that you could record things, but more importantly, that you could go and rent movies. Boy, things have changed so quickly. But the network television had a huge influence, and so it was a different world in 1985. It was a world, especially in terms of news and information. The typical literate person, the typical sort of person who was engaged with the public affairs and cared about politics and world events, got their news from their local newspaper, like the Philadelphia Inquirer, and television news, local news, of course, but more importantly, network news, which was like the serious news, where they would actually tell you about world affairs and approach things in a more sophisticated way. But local news continues to be important too. But that was where people got their information, and we obviously live in a different world now. But it is the world that Postman is talking about. More than once, he refers sarcastically to television newscasters as kind of like the pop culture stars of their day. And because so much of the book is about infotainment, right? So I don't think he had heard that expression. I don't know if it's in the book or not. But this whole thesis about how television is really bad at doing anything else but purely entertaining people, and how it is the worst possible medium for any kind of serious public discourse. So a lot of his concern is with say, television news and what he would consider to be the terrible job it actually does in presenting news and encouraging people to be thoughtful about political developments. There is no such dominance today. I think that one of the things that when we think about our culture is how fragmented it is in terms of all sorts of ways, but politically fragmented, and fragmented in terms of people's chosen source of information, which is maybe the biggest issue of our day, especially after the election of Trump, is that we all seem to live in different worlds, and largely or have different worldviews. And those worldviews are, to a very large extent, shaped by what sources of information we choose to have. That choice was not available in 1985. If you wanted to get alternative sources of information, you really had to work pretty hard. To read, even for a Philadelphian, let's say, to read the New York Times, not many did, or the Washington Post, the dominant national newspapers of today. You read your local newspaper and you relied upon it to give you an accurate and thoughtful description of what was happening in the world. Today, we live in a world where nobody reads the newspaper, physical newspaper. And the availability of information on the internet is so contested in terms of its legitimacy that I guess we all make do. One of the things that McLuhan said is that each new medium has as its content the old medium. And that's true of my use of the internet. Probably half the things that I do on the internet are read newspapers, Washington Post and the New York Times. And that's what I do on this little thing that I have, this magical thing called my my $200 Chromebook, which is, let me tell you, I got a lot of use out of this thing. I'm sure you who don't have my background in growing up with newspapers around the house, perhaps, or you don't physically read newspapers. You have different sources, and you make your way the way that we all do, sort of try to find something that we can trust in terms of. But that dominance is gone, not just in terms of news, but in 1985. A popular TV show at the time, something like, say, Cheers. You might have heard of that. It's a very big, very popular sitcom from the 80s, and really quite well done. Very good show. Everybody watched that. Everybody watched the same shows. Everybody watched television. So any source, I mean, the audiences were huge compared to today. Again, everything's so fragmented today. So the kind of influence that television had, and especially the kind of influence that the major networks had in 1985, was a lot different. And if I think of anything in terms of keeping it in mind, and maybe this will give you some more sympathy for Postman's theme and his purpose of writing the book, if there's anything to keep in mind, is that was the case largely until, I would say, well into the 90s, probably into the 2000s. The tremendous dominance of television as an influencer. And the way that people watched television was different then. You turned it on, and then at a certain point you turned it off. But you let it in that McLuhan type way. It massaged you, that whole time it was on, with all the different programming, commercials included. That world is obviously gone. We live in a different situation. So I just want to let you know, I mean, that is something to keep in mind. I'm not assuming that Postman's critique of television is going to have the kind of force now that it had in 1985, but we'll see what we can make of it.